In my previous video I made a point of rejecting what I see false dichotomy of seeing the world divided into a rational framework on the one hand and as opposed to a religious mindset on the other hand, and presenting the world's population as if you need to fall in either one camp or another, and that the two are diametrically opposed, never the twain shall meet, and they must be necessarily in conflict with each other. I reject that dichotomy out of hand. I don't see it working in reality. I don't see it working within myself, and I don't see it working within any other human being on the planet, including, for example, Thunderfoot, who likes to present himself as an exclusively rational person on a site like this. But this is not about him. This is about these statements that I made in a previous video, and that led to some misunderstandings. Because when I start making statements such as, for example, a moral code, let's stick to morality, because I think that's what I'm going to base the rest of this video on. In my opinion, a moral code is ultimately based on an instinctive and emotional human response. We have an instinctive sense of fairness, for example, and we have other instinctive human abilities, and that lead to emotional responses. And that is what our moral code is ultimately based on: a sense of what is right and what is wrong, what is fair, what is unfair, and so on and so forth. Now, if I were indeed anti-scientific, that would be the end of it. It would be a mystery based on human emotions that cannot be questioned, that cannot be investigated, and we shouldn't query it. We should just let the emotions be the deciding factor. But that is, of course, very unhelpful. It gets you so far, but no further. And a scientific understanding of what underlies these instincts, what underlies these emotional responses to injustice or unfairness, for example, will help deepen our very own understanding of what drives our own moral codes, and that is extremely important. And let me illustrate that by an example. We understand now, in the last decades we've come to understand, that a lot of our emotional responses are based on the actions of mirror neurons, especially when it comes to emotional responses to things such as injustice and unfairness. Mirror neurons are neurons that fire when other people are performing actions or are undergoing experiences that we also know for ourselves, and they mirror the neurons that would be firing if we ourselves were experiencing such things or were engaged in such actions. And that gives us the ability to empathize with another person, to kind of feel a little bit what it's like to be in that other person's shoe and to go through what they are going through. And that is one of the underlying mechanisms that helps us create something like a moral code. We know that something is wrong because we know how we would feel if it happened to us, so we can imagine what another person feels like when it happens to them, so we consider it to be wrong for something like that to happen to them. We are starting to scientifically understand what underlies the mechanisms that lead to us building up a moral code. And that is immensely helpful. For example, if you are looking at two slightly different moral codes from two different societies, for example, you can take a objective-ish look at what these moral codes entail, and if you find that one of those moral codes, for example, is severely lacking in empathy, for example, you know that this is a moral code that has become somewhat flawed, that has become corrupted. It is no longer in touch with the original human instincts and emotional responses to injustice, for example, that would normally lead to a moral code. There is something wrong with that moral code, and we can therefore objectively state that that moral code is in some way or other inferior to the moral code of the other society that incorporates a lot more understanding of empathy, sympathy with other people, knowing what it's like to be them. Things like the golden rule, things that you don't want to happen to yourself, don't do them to other people. So that is how we can, using a little bit of scientific understanding of what underlies our emotional responses, we can decide whether something abstract like a system of law, for example, is of good or bad quality. We can easily point out examples like of this, something like, for example, the rules around freedom of expression that we enjoy in our Western societies are a great example of a moral code that is quite well defined, well formed. It is certainly based on solid principles of human empathy and understanding that people need to be able to express themselves. Whereas, for example, something like Sharia law, we can understand now that with its harsh punishments and its total lack of empathy for the humanity of, for example, somebody who gives in to their temptations and who cannot help but become an adulterer, for example, that the sheer harshness of that punishment that is entailed in something like Sharia law makes it a suspect set of laws, makes it a suspect moral code, something that is clearly flawed and that needs to be addressed. That is where scientific understanding is hugely important, because without that it would just be two arbitrary sets of laws and we can't decide which one is better than the other.